How many of us feel traumatized by the idea of having a conversation about race? Our blood pressure goes up. What comes to mind are images of people being terrible to one another and phrases like build a wall or hands up, don't shoot. It's no wonder that instead of engaging each other, we fall into silence. And it's not even that it's just around issues of physical violence. Even when we talk about racial identity, there's enmity.
People have been criticized for identifying as a race that they may not have been born with. To the left is a woman named Rachel Dolezal. She was born white. Her picture in the middle is sort of what she looks like nowadays. She does a lot of work on African American issues, and she identifies as black. To the right is a woman named Andrea Smith. She's a professor at the University of California. She researches Native American issues, and she chose to identify as Native American or Cherokee. And not only is this happening here in the United States, it's happening in different parts of the world. This is Tiffany. She's a Filipino-Chinese. She was born in the Philippines, went to the University of the Philippines, and she graduated with a perfect GPA, the very first one ever to graduate from the University of the Philippines with a perfect GPA. When this happened, her family was criticized as not being Filipino enough and were told to go back to China.
And so if there's anything that Bessie and I have learned in the work that we've been doing, it's that we all share the same human core and we're all the same at our base. We all started out in sub-Saharan Africa and started to move out of sub-Saharan Africa some 60,000 years ago, and we traversed the globe adjusting to the environment around us. And anybody who survived that is a genetic winner, because there's absolutely zero chance that we would make it through that trek to be sitting here today. And so as we start having conversations, what Bessie and I were able to do is pull together people who do not share the same racial background. They're people who come from different academic disciplines, from different scholarship, from different political backgrounds. And we've managed to bring them together, not just to talk about race, but in exciting, insightful, and fun ways, if you can imagine that.
We will begin by sharing with you our research protocol, and then we're going to share some of the results of our research, and we're going to discuss what these imply for conversations on race. So our research protocol begins with a pre-survey where we engage people in questions such as, what is your race? How would you answer census categories? What are some of your family narratives about race? With whom have you shared your participation in this study? And how do you think they will react? And then we collect a sample of saliva from them, send it off to a DNA lab for processing, and then we share the results back with them once we receive them and engage them again in a post-survey that asks essentially the same questions.
And we've been really pleased that this work has been received really well all over the place. We've been on panels regionally, nationally, internationally. We've had news coverage regionally and nationally. And we've published regionally and nationally. We just had an article published in one of the best journals in our field of communication studies. So this has been very exciting and work that's really meant a lot to us.
These are my children. This is the day when we received the DNA profile of my son back. And of course, his younger sister wants to see it first. She grabs a computer from him and she goes, what? Because the results showed up as 98% East Asian, 1% Native American, and 1% African. And of course, my husband goes, what? Because he's white.
and not only have our family members found this interesting, as we've tested people, some of the things that we've found have been really fascinating. For example, the gentleman here thought that he would be about 100% European in his background, and he was predominantly a European in his background. However, 69% of his profile was European Jewish. He had no idea of that. There was no narrative in his family that talked about having a Jewish background, and he wondered where that came from. And with that much, you can only imagine that there's some narrative in the family that may have been suppressed. Taking a look at the woman who's here, she identifies as Latina. And if you look at her profile, it's really from Africa, from Europe, and she has an additional 15 regions. And this reinforces the idea that being Latina is more of an ethnicity and a cultural background rather than a geographic background, but that's how she certainly identifies. Now here's somebody whose background is more typically what we think of as Latino. It is from the Iberian Peninsula around Spain, and from Italy and Greece, and also you see Native American. And notice he also has 12 other regions. One of the things that we have found about Latinos is that they are truly citizens of the world with some of the most complex backgrounds that you're going to find. And here's a woman who identifies her background as 100% Italian. And she said when she got these results, the family went into a panic, because when they looked at this, you can see that not the majority of what is in her background is Italian. Now, as we looked at the details of her map, when we looked at where her family is from, you see major regions in the darker, and then you see the trace regions that are just circled. The trace regions go all across North Africa and into the Middle East, and the major regions all over Europe, and Italy is right there in the middle. So what happens is we see a broader story of what her family brings genetically to this 100% Italian background. And this happens to be my daughter. Bessie got her kids in. This is my daughter, who we've used as the guinea pig to do these DNA tests. So I've tested her over the years, but it took 10 years in to test myself and my husband. The interesting thing is that both of our biological daughters have a genetic glitch, and it comes from a recessive gene. And my husband is white, and I'm African American, which we consider two different categories. And it's like, how could we have the same recessive gene? Well, when we tested my husband, he's like 96% British specifically in his background. And when we tested me, I have 18% British in my background. So it really isn't surprising at all that we would have a recessive gene in common. And then finally, this gentleman walked into our office one day and he said, I'd like for you to test me, because he was from the Caribbean, and he said, I believe my grandfather, whom he did not know, was from India. And he said, people look at me and they don't believe that narrative that's in my family. So when we tested him, notice he's got 13% South Asian, which is actually consistent with a grandparent. So while people look at him and disbelieve his story, his genetic story is consistent with the narrative of his family.
We're going to move on from personal narratives to some quantitative results. And one of the first questions we asked was, how will others react to your DNA profile? And we show you the results before and after. And you can see that before the DNA test, about half of people expected other people to react positively. But after they receive their DNA test, the biggest chunk is surprise, and then followed by other, which includes statements such as, or attitudes such as skeptical, upset, and angry. And the second research question we wanted to look at was, how will others react to your DNA profile? Oh, sorry.
That's right.
Moving on. The second research question we wanted to ask was, how will the DNA test change your family narrative? And we show you two graphs representing those who identify as European versus those who are non-European. For the European group, you will see that the biggest chunk said they will do more research. But a big percentage, about a third, said that they are not going to change anything. And compare this to the sample of people who are non-European, the biggest percentage said that they will add that information to their narrative. Another question we wanted to ask was, how will the DNA test change your behavior? And in this particular question, we show you a difference between females and males, because the difference is quite interesting. For females on the left, you will see that most females said they will do more research. But for the males, which would be on the right, the biggest percentage said there's not going to be any change in my behavior.
And that's actually consistent with other research that we've done that says that women tend to be more flexible on the issue of identification and race as compared to men. So this is just another way of seeing that same data.
And the last piece of information we're going to share with you quantitatively is we wanted to look at whether there was a difference in initial identification for those who identified as white versus those who identified as non-white. And you can see from this graph that those who identified as white, about 2/3 of them said that they were only white. But for those who identified as non-white, everybody said that they had at least 2 or more different races or ethnicities.
Yes, and that actually fits in with the next set of information that we're going to take a look at. This is overestimation and underestimation, and the red here represents overestimation and the blue underestimation. Far and away, the most overestimated category was European, and there seem to be 2 reasons for this. First of all, people who were white, who identified as white, would say, I have a 100% European background. So when they would find other things, they had overestimated their European. And also, as we showed in the earlier research, you found that people of color would tend to say that they had other things in their background. So they too would overestimate how much European they had in their background. So you found everybody leaning into that European narrative because they felt there was some benefit to it. Next, looking at the African background, there were some people who overestimated it for a variety of reasons, but a number of people who are African American didn't think about other things in their background like Middle East, so sometimes they would overestimate it. Looking at Latino, not one person overestimated their Latino background. And it's interesting because other research tells us, and remember we said that this is more of a culture than a geographic region. So there's other research that says that people who started out on the census identifying as Latino, the same person over time would often switch to white. So they too were leaning into that. And then finally, not one person overestimated their Asian ancestry. And it was very rare for anybody who didn't have an identifiable relative who was Asian to say that they had any Asian in their background. And it's an interesting phenomenon because people still tend to think of Asian as foreign, even though the first Americans came across the Bering Strait into the Americas and became Native Americans. But we still have that perception.
We're also going to share with you some of our results from a group of interracial individuals. And we want to start out by talking about how they used to be framed in early research. Way back in the 1930s, the seminal work on interracial individuals was entitled The Problem of the Marginal Man, which shows you that society viewed them as a complication.
And we wanted to look at interracial people because we felt that they might be at the forefront in looking at where race is going today. And indeed, as we looked at older people who were biracial, we found a difference as opposed to younger people. These are 2 people who identified as interracial and were part of our research project. The gentleman is younger than the woman, but he's from the South and from a conservative area. And even though his beloved mother is white, both of them have a white mother and an African American father, he said he would only ever identify himself as African American. Now, the woman was interesting because she didn't even know, she's in her 60s, she didn't even know until she was a young adult that she was interracial. She thought that her mother was just light and didn't realize it. When she always thought of herself as African American, and when we tested her and found that most of her profile was European, she found that very traumatizing and actually dropped out of the project that we were doing.
These people would tend to say things like, I am very proud of my heritage, I don't believe these results are mine, or the lab must have made a mistake.
On the other hand, when we talked to young people, they were really pleased to have multiracial backgrounds. And research that came out of Harvard says that immigration, multiculturalism, the young, and genetic testing are causing us to rethink how we think about race.
And I'd like to point out 2 things at this point. The first one is that there are several factors that go into racial identification. One would think DNA, biology, hard science, right? That should play a major role in identification, but it's not always the case. So we have people who would change their identification based on their DNA results, but then we have other people who would just would totally disregard their results and refuse to budge on their identification. And the second factor is family narrative. Family narrative is so powerful, which is what we found in how people choose to identify. And the third thing is even things such as how one was culturally raised or one's cultural experiences plays a big role in identification. For example, I am 99.9% Chinese, according to my genetic profile. But I was born and raised in the Philippines, so I feel very strongly that this is part of my identity. And the second thing I want to bring up is that what happens when there are unexpected results in one's DNA profile? Because this leads to some level of cognitive dissonance that people have to deal with, especially if it contains a race or ethnicity that one may feel prejudiced toward. One of the best ways to reduce prejudice is to encourage interpersonal contact between different people. But what if the difference is inside you? Think of the power of that information in breaking down racial barriers. And it also underscores the fact that we are 99% the same in our DNA. The percentage of my DNA that makes me look different from Anita or anybody else is 0.1%. Think of the power of that information in fostering acceptance.
And the society is moving in this direction. Over the last 2 census times, people were allowed to pick more than one race on the census forms.
And there is talk that in the future, they may take away race questions from the census.
So just imagine.
This is a graphic that represents a new gene editing technology called CRISPR. CRISPR is a breakthrough technology that allows scientists to manipulate DNA to treat medical concerns. But now we go into the issue of genetic engineering. What if somebody said, I want to change the color of my child's hair, or the color of my son's eyes, or the color of my daughter's skin, right? How do you feel that this kind of information would change the way people choose to identify racially?
And because it's at the genetic level, this changes generations that follow. So the things that we have found that people have responded to is to say that this gives them a sense that they belong to the world and are part of a world community.
One of the professors that we asked, how do you identify? What is your race? And he said, human.
Yes. So after all of the things that people have said to us, they've said they're surprised, they find this awesome, some even find it boring.
One of my friends found that her profile only had white in it. And she was quite upset, and she said, this is absolutely boring. More and more we find that people who take this or join this project want to find something different. They want more diversity in their DNA profile.
And so to all the words that we have said to you and you have said to us in doing this project, we'd like to offer a challenge that people go out and do this DNA testing for themselves, find out what diversity is in your own background, reach out to other people who are similar to, you think, or different than yourself, and engage others to find out about our human core.